Welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica, and today's video is another episode of True Crime Sunday. Now, I've always been, for whatever reason, very intrigued by true crime, and I am from the state of Oregon. So initially, when I started this series, I was bringing you cases from my home state. But as time has gone on, I thought it might be interesting to broaden my horizons and bring you cases from all over the world. Now, this case was actually recommended to me by my dear friend Andy. Her channel name is Andy Does Stuff. I will link her channel, of course, in my description box. She is from the state of Ohio, and so this case is coming from the state of Ohio, specifically from the city of Springfield. She reached out to me, I think, in April, and she said, I have a case from my home state that I really think you should cover in a video. And she told me about the book detailing the case. So I did go onto Amazon and I picked up the book, and it just took me a long time to get through it. I mean, life also gets in the way of my best laid plans. But this book right here, Hometown Killer by Carol J. Rothgeb, or Rothgeb, not exactly sure how you pronounce her last name, is the book that, of course, Andy recommended that I pick up detailing this case. And this is one of the most detailed true crime books I have ever read. And I will say that this case is very involved. There's lots of detail, lots of different occurrences that went on. So I'm going to do my best to give you as much detail as I possibly can, but in the interest of time, maybe summarize some of the things I'll be talking about. But if you're interested in picking up this book, I highly recommend doing so. I will pop a link, the Amazon link to this book, in my description box. Now, this is the case of William K. Sapp, and in the early 1990s, he brutally sexually assaulted and murdered 12-year-old Free Morrow and her best friend, 11-year-old Martha Leach. He also brutally murdered another woman and viciously attacked 2 other women. Now, I do believe that there are other crimes that were committed in that area in Ohio and also in Florida, where he had once lived, that he is guilty of, but he was not convicted of those crimes. And I also want to say that I will be giving you guys the facts of this case differently, in a different format than what I've done in the past. It just made more sense to do it differently than I normally do. I hope that's okay with you guys. And I also want to give you a huge disclaimer, as I do in all of my true crime videos. Viewer discretion is absolutely advised. I will be detailing some extremely violent sexual crimes. I would not have young viewers around while you're watching or listening to this video. And I want to warn you that some of the things I'll be talking about in this video might be very triggering, and this may not be for everyone. And if this is a video that you feel like you need to skip, I completely understand that. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of William K. Sapp. In the summer of 1992 in Springfield, Ohio, 12-year-old Free Morrow and 11-year-old Martha Leach were just embarking on a brand new friendship. Now, at this point, they'd only known each other for a few months, but they just clicked and became best friends, and their goal was to spend as much time together as they possibly could before starting 7th grade. Now, Free had a pretty rough start to life. She was actually born with a hole in her stomach and spent the first 7 months of her life being treated in the hospital. And unfortunately, her parents divorced before she was a year old. Sadly, her mother Susan struggled with alcoholism, so her father Benny was granted full custody of her. But as Free grew up, she really enjoyed spending time with her mother on the north side of town. Benny lived on the south side of town. Now, Benny wasn't real thrilled with that, because the north side of town was seen as the more low-income side, more of the criminal element. There was a lot of sex work, a lot of drug dealing going on. And Susan was a pretty lax parent, pretty loosey-goosey. There were not as many rules at Susan's house as there were at Benny's house. But Benny loved his daughter very much, and of course wanted to encourage her to have a relationship with her mom. So against his better judgment, he would often let her stay at her mom's house. Now, around the corner from her mom's house lived 11-year-old Martha Leach with her mom, Jetty. Now, Jetty was very different from Susan. She ran a very tight ship. She was a single mother of 5 children, so there was no loosey-goosey stuff going on. Her house was immaculate, and she kept a very watchful eye over all 5 of her children. Now, one of the things that really bonded Free and Martha to each other is that they were both products of a divorced family, and they just really related to one another. And they were just the typical preteen girls, you know? They loved music, they loved makeup, they loved boys, they loved hanging out and giggling. And they were known around the town of Springfield, Ohio as a duo, where one was, the other one was always following closely behind. On the night of Friday, August 21st, 1992, both girls spent the night at Benny Morrow's house. And the following morning, Saturday, August 22nd, Free begged her dad to take both girls back over to her mom's house so they could spend the rest of the weekend over there. And against Benny's better judgment, he agreed to take the girls over to Susan's house, but he was very clear with Free that this would be the last weekend he was going to allow this to go on, that school was starting the next week, and he really wanted her to get serious about getting ready for school and not spend so much time over at loosey-goosey mom's house. So when he dropped the girls off at Susan's house, they went inside, and Susan gave Free some money and said, hey, can you girls run over to the local bar and pick me up a pack of cigarettes, which was pretty common. The bar owner was used to the girls coming in and doing that for Susan. Then when the girls got back home, they ran a couple errands with a 16-year-old girlfriend of Susan's. And then when they got back, they just went over to Martha's house and hung out in the backyard with a few of their boyfriends, same age, just sitting around listening to music and talking and laughing. Now, something that the boys said that they thought was strange is that Free told the boys that later on that evening, both she and Martha had a date with an older boy. She didn't say who it was with or what the date entailed, just that they had a date with an older boy and that they needed to meet him at Schuler's Bakery, which was a few blocks away. And they asked if they could borrow one of the boys' bikes, and he agreed to let them take his bike with them. So at around 4:30 or 5, they went inside Martha's house and let her mom know that they had gotten a couple dollars from a neighbor guy and that they were going to ride their friend's bike down to Schuler's Bakery to pick up some donuts and that they would be back in a couple of hours. And Jetty said, that's fine, but you guys have to be back in time for dinner. And Martha and Free both said that they would be. Now, dinner came and went, and there was no sign of either one of the girls. And later on that evening, their guy friend who had loaned them the bike came over to Martha's mother's house looking for the bike. And she's like, you haven't seen them either? And he said, no, I haven't seen them since they left here. And that's when she went into full panic mode. She was like, there's something wrong here, because Martha would never do that. She knew that if she acted that way, she'd get in a lot of trouble. So Jetty started going around the neighborhood and calling for the girls, asking people if they'd seen the girls, and no one had seen them. Finally, she hopped in her car and drove across town to where Benny Morrow lived and said, hey, the girls are missing. I haven't seen them for hours. They didn't come home for dinner, and I'm really getting scared here. So Benny, in a blind panic, no shoes on, hops in his car, and they both start going all around the neighborhoods looking for the girls. Now, eventually they did go and track Susan down at the local bar, and when they went inside to tell her that both Free and Martha were missing, rather than her joining immediately with the search, she waited until her boyfriend had finished his beer and then kind of reluctantly joined in the search. Now, they did go down to the bakery, and they actually scoured the area behind the bakery. It was this makeshift man-made pond with flashlights, and they didn't see anything. They even actually walked down to part of the sewer system that was called the Lion's Cage. It was like the stairway down into this cement room, is the best way I can describe it. Had graffiti all over. It was this place that, teenage kids would often hang out, and there was absolutely no sign of anybody. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the parents faced their biggest fears and reported the girls missing. They called the police and made missing persons reports for both girls. And eventually, out of just sheer exhaustion, the parents went home and tried to get a few hours of sleep. Now, the following morning, on Sunday, August 23rd, these two grade school aged boys decided to hop on their bikes and leave the church picnic that they'd been at to ride over to the man-made pond behind Schuler's Bakery to check out the goldfish. That was something they commonly did. And as soon as they parked their bikes and started walking up towards the pond, they came across the most grisly scene they had ever seen in their entire lives. They found the bodies of two young girls, partially covered by these large wooden pallets and brush, sticks, branches, leaves. They were naked from the waist down, posed in very similar positions. One girl actually had a large stick protruding out of her bottom, and the boys were just horrified. They turn around and they happen to see a fire truck not far away with several firemen standing around, and they just raced as fast as they could to get help from these firemen. And of course, the police were called. They came down to the pond and the investigation was on from there. Now, of course, these bodies belong to 12-year-old Free Morrow and 11-year-old Martha Leach. Like I said, they were naked from the waist down. Their bodies, especially their heads, had been beaten profusely with some kind of object. And actually, Free's head had been smashed with a large lava rock to the point where it looked to the boys and to the police officers that her head had been replaced by the rock. And Martha's face had been so horribly beaten that there were large pieces of dirt deeply embedded into the flesh. And something that they noticed right away was that both girls' bodies had been positioned exactly the same. Like this whole thing was very staged. And it was obvious that whoever had done this was very angry, but also very much in control. It was also very obvious that both girls had been sexually assaulted. And as the police officers were surveying the crime scene, they got notified that a couple blocks away at the lion's cage, the part of the sewer system that I was talking about, that kind of like recessed concrete room, that's the best way I can describe it, other police officers had found the bike that they'd borrowed and also several articles of the girls' clothing. One article in particular was a pair of flowered shorts that Free had been wearing. Now, someone had taken a very sharp knife while Free was wearing the shorts, they were positive, and sliced the inseam completely open in those shorts, but right across the seam, almost like a professional tailor had done it. And they noticed when the girls were deposited into body bags and taken down to the hospital morgue, and their bodies were thoroughly examined, that there was no knife wound on Free's inner thighs. So somebody had taken the time to very calmly and very precisely slice her shorts open and remove them from her body, but not give her any injuries doing that. So that almost, they kind of felt like that was almost the killer's signature. They were able to obtain semen samples from both girls, and they determined by DNA analysis that the same person had sexually assaulted both girls. And now, of course, came the awful task for the police to go and inform Susan and Jetty and Benny that they had found their daughters dead, brutally raped, brutally murdered at the pond's edge behind Schuler's Bakery. And the really unreal thing is that they'd all been there the night before, Susan, Jetty, and Benny, with flashlights, looking around this pond and also going to the lion's cage and looking with flashlights, and they didn't see anything. I mean, they were almost right on top of the girls and did not see them. Now, that's when the interrogations really began. They really cued in on the parents because quite often when things like this happen, the victims are very well known to the perpetrators. And they were a little suspicious of Susan's behavior. The fact that when they went to get her from the bar, she was just kind of like, well, we're going to finish our beer and then we'll join you guys. I don't think she realized that this was as serious as it was. I mean, how could you? I mean, nothing like this had ever happened. And so she just didn't think anything of it, honestly. She just thought they were being girls out running around. And unfortunately, this was the awful, tragic end that these girls had come to. But it didn't take long for them to realize that Benny, Jetty, and Susan had absolutely nothing to do with these crimes. And so then they just started going around the neighborhood and questioning anyone and everyone that they possibly could, if they'd seen the girls, where they'd seen the girls, just trying to piece together their last movements. They, of course, did go to Schuler's Bakery and interrogated the two clerks that were working there that night on Saturday, August 22nd. And they said, yeah, both Free and Martha were here that night around 5:30. They came in with a guy that looked like he was probably in his early 20s, white guy, about 170 pounds, had sandy brown hair cut in a crew cut. His cheekbones were really prominent and he was very emaciated looking. He and Martha actually came into Schuler's Bakery to pick up the donuts while Free stood outside with a watchful eye on the bike. They hung out in there for a little while and then they left. The two clerks never saw them again. There were also some reports of a van, a dark van that was idling down the street from the bakery that night. And there were also other reports that they had seen two girls either being forced into the van or two girls just getting into the van that night as well. But within a few days of the girls' bodies being found, the police got wind of a 20-year-old local man by the name of Jamie Turner, and the fact that he was telling anyone and everyone that he had witnessed the brutal rapes and murders of both Free and Martha. Now, this man was cognitively delayed. I mean, everybody in the area knew that he had some severe intellectual deficiencies. And so initially everyone thought, I don't really know that we can believe what he's saying, but he just kept at it. So finally the police went and picked Jamie Turner up and brought him down to the police station and started questioning him. Now, initially his story was that he was hiding up in a tree near the pond and witnessed a man brutally sexually assault and murder both Free and Martha. But as they continued to question him, his story started to change. Not only that, but there were some details that Jamie knew that had not been released to the public. So they were thinking, maybe he was there, or maybe he was involved with what had happened. And eventually, as they continued to question him, Jamie said that there were other men at the scene of the crime. His really good friend, 20-year-old John Balzer, and John's stepdad, 33-year-old David Marszewski. He also said that his 27-year-old cousin happened to be there as well. Now, all three of these other men were also seen as having extreme intellectual deficiencies, very cognitively delayed. And so they were thinking, could these guys really be involved with this crime? How is that possible? But they couldn't just, let this go. So they did go and pick up John, David, and the 27-year-old cousin, brought them down to the police station and started questioning them. And these guys also had pretty intimate details of the crime scene that were never released to the public. So the police are like, okay, these guys definitely had something to do with this crime. But the weird thing is that they would kind of get stuck on a particular story or giving details a particular way, and then all of a sudden it would change and they'd start blaming each other or then saying they had nothing to do with it. They were never involved. So they were like, what in the hell is going on? Ultimately, they did arrest all four men, and they did take blood samples from all four men as well. But strangely, none of the DNA matched with the semen samples that had already been taken from Free and Martha. So again, they question these guys and they're like, listen, we do believe you had something to do with this. However, there's got to be somebody else involved in this crime. Who is it? Who is this other person? And they would give them all these various names of people. So they were going and rounding up all these random people that these guys were naming, testing their blood. No one's DNA matched. They could not find a DNA match for the semen, or to the semen samples that were taken from Free and Martha. So this went on for quite some time, for several months. And finally, in April of 1993, they basically let John and David and Jamie and the cousin go because they just didn't have enough physical evidence really to hold them in jail. But they released them with a technique called without prejudice. I don't know if that's the right wording, but basically saying that they could be re-indicted for these crimes later on down the road if they were able to amass more physical evidence proving that these guys had something to do with the rapes and murders of Free and Martha. On the evening of September 7th, 1993, 30-year-old Belinda Anderson left her sister's house, who she was preparing dinner with, and said she needed to walk down to a local payphone to make a phone call. Now, Belinda was a Springfield, Ohio resident, but had moved away to try to kind of start a new life for herself. She had gotten pretty embroiled into the criminal element in Springfield, Ohio. Sex work, drug dealing, drug paraphernalia, writing bad checks. And her sister was just thrilled that Belinda had moved away and kind of turned a new leaf over for herself and was really enjoying having Belinda there that night and making dinner with her. But she was a little skeptical when Belinda said she needed to leave and walk down to the local payphone. She thought, oh boy, here we go again. Belinda's starting into her previous activities. And unfortunately, Belinda never returned to her sister's house. And within a few hours, of course, her sister was getting pretty worried, pretty scared, like, what the hell happened to my sister? So, of course, she goes down to the police station to report this, basically to report her sister as missing. And the police were like, listen, she's got a long rap sheet. She's been doing stuff for quite some time that is not great. So maybe let's give her a few days and see if she comes home. But by Tuesday of the following week, Belinda still had not returned to her sister's house or her home in the neighboring city. So there was an official missing persons report filed for Belinda. A month later, in October of 1993, a man was driving down East Main Street, close to Schuler's Bakery, where he came upon a 28-year-old woman who had been horribly beaten and was bleeding profusely. Of course, this man stops to assist her, and they contact the police. And when the police arrived, she basically told the police that she was walking down the sidewalk when all of a sudden this man accosted her and pulled her back behind a building and started beating her over the head and the shoulders with a large pipe. And somehow she was able to get the pipe away from him, and in a panic, he fled. And she really didn't give the police a very good description of what he looked like, other than he was tall, kind of big, and had shoulder-length, dirty, greasy brown hair. 2 months later, in the early morning hours of December 8th, 1993, a man happened to be driving down a road close to the YMCA in Springfield, Ohio, when he came upon 38-year-old Hazel Pearson. She was horribly beaten, horribly battered, and was bleeding profusely. He immediately pulled over, found a payphone, and called the police. And when the police arrived and started investigating, they couldn't even tell what race she was. Every single ounce of her exposed skin was so battered and so bruised that they literally could not tell what race she was. They started to really look into Hazel's injuries, and they just could not believe what they were seeing. Her cheekbones had been so smashed that they were basically like free floating in her face. Her jaw had been broken in several places. She had an obvious skull fracture. She had a really deep H-shaped wound in the back of her head. And her neck was sliced from ear to ear so deeply that her trachea was exposed. And she had been outside for so long and exposed to such cold temperatures that eventually she had to have several toes removed due to frostbite. They also noticed that she was pantless. She was sitting on her pants. And when they stood her up to get her into the ambulance and were looking at her pants, they noticed right away that the inseam of her pants had been sliced expertly from one leg all the way around to the other leg. And that clicked in the investigator's mind that that's exactly how they found Free Morrow's shorts. That inseam had been expertly sliced. And when they got Hazel to the hospital and were really, checking her out, they noticed that she had no wound to the inside of her thighs. And obviously she had been wearing the pants when the person that attacked her had sliced through them. So they knew that that had to be connected, that they possibly had a serial rapist and potential murderer in Springfield, Ohio, but they just had absolutely no clue who he was. Now, initially, Hazel couldn't talk. She was so horribly beaten that she just could not speak, but she kept doing this when they would ask her what he looked like. So they were pretty sure he wore glasses. And, she obviously was hospitalized, had multiple plastic surgeries to try to correct the damage that had been done. And as she was healing in the hospital, was able to communicate better. She really didn't have a lot of memories about the night of the attack. All she could clearly remember was that she had been at a local bar with her boyfriend not far from her home, that they'd gotten into an argument, and she just got pissed and left and was going to walk home. And suddenly this man just jumped out of nowhere and grabbed her and dragged her back behind the YMCA. She said that he was a little over 6 feet tall, weighed over 200 pounds, Caucasian, had thick black rimmed glasses on, and had long shoulder length, dirty, greasy, curly hair. So of course the police start to canvass her neighborhood, just going basically door to door and asking people, hey, Hazel Pearson was viciously attacked. Did you see anything? Did anyone see anything? Can you give us any kind of clues or help here? They happened to knock on a particular door of a home that was just kind of around the corner from Hazel Pearson's house. And a woman by the name of Karen Sapp answered the door. She said, hey, yeah, come on in. We can chat with you guys. And she introduced the police officers to her husband, Bill Sapp. Now, ironically, Bill had just had his head shaved and was completely clean shaven, but was very calm, answered all their questions. He did say that he'd seen kind of a suspicious looking man that matched that description walking around the neighborhood on the night of the attack. But that really, they couldn't be much more help than that. So the police just left the Sapp residence and continued to canvass the area, but unfortunately were not able to get any other clues or leads as to who attacked Hazel Pearson. Now, at the beginning of 1994, the police investigators were still thoroughly investigating the brutal sexual assaults and murders of 12-year-old Free and 11-year-old Martha. And finally, after all the interrogations of Jamie, John, and David, and ultimately of David's wife, Wanda, the story of that horrendous night that the police finally pieced together that they felt was the most accurate version of what had happened, and the version that they felt they could really pursue criminal charges against all four of these people and it would stick, was the following. At some point during the early afternoon of Saturday, August 22nd, Free and Martha happened to run into 20-year-old John Balzer somewhere in the neighborhood. Now, they knew who he was. They were friendly with him, so they just kind of chatted for a little while. And John said, "Hey, would you guys like to come to a party with me later?" And I think, honestly, they felt sorry for John. They knew that he was commonly teased around the neighborhood for being so slow mentally. And also, I think, 12 and 11, this 20-year-old guy is asking them to go to a party. They probably felt cool and thought, oh yeah, this would be really fun. Just mischievous preteen girl stuff. So they did meet him down at the bakery. He did go inside with Martha. They picked out some donuts and then they left together. And that's when they went to the van, the dark van that was idling down the street from the bakery, and met up with David Marszewski, John's stepfather, and then their buddy, Jamie Turner. There was also another man that was driving the van that they would not identify. No matter what they threatened them with or anything, they just would not identify the person that was driving the van. They never did. Not yet, anyway. So from this point, they either forced the girls in the van or the girls get in the van on their own. That was debated. And they took them down to an apartment on Linden Avenue, which was not far away. And this is another part of the story that was very heavily debated. A couple of the perpetrators said they never went to the apartment, and a couple of them said, yes, they did go to the apartment. The police did go and search the Linden Avenue apartment, and no forensic evidence at all was found there. But the story was that, yes, they did go into the apartment. I guess Free made some disparaging remark, according to them, about John and Jamie, and they just lost their temper and horribly beat both girls. And then John, David, Jamie, and this unidentified man took turns sexually assaulting both girls. But John, David, and Jamie were wearing condoms, but the unidentified man was not, and that's who they got the DNA sample from. They took the unconscious girls, put them back into the van, and then took them down to the pond where they continued to beat them. Now, Martha, at this point, they felt had passed away, but Free was still alive. And John was just panicking because he didn't know what to do. She was screaming, wouldn't be quiet. Nothing they would do would get her to stop screaming. So he left the scene and went not far away to get his mother, Wanda, and have her come down and help them figure out what to do. And she actually came to the scene and felt for Free's pulse and said, "You're going to have to kill her." She was pretty sure Martha was already gone. And Free begged her, looked her right in the eye and begged her, "Please stop them from doing this to us. Go get my dad." And Wanda just turned around and walked away, went back to work. So basically, they just continued to beat both girls with these large rocks. The unidentified man picks up this huge lava rock and bashes it over Free's head, ultimately killing her. So once this whole gruesome scene was finished, John goes back and gets his mother, Wanda, has her come back down to the pond and just says, "We need your help cleaning this up. We don't know what to do." So she starts to order people around, telling this person, "You take the bike and their shorts and take them down to the lion's cage and toss them down the stairwell. I have no idea who posed the bodies. I don't know. But yeah, that's ultimately what happened to these two beautiful young women. So by mid-1994, they were finally able to go forward with multiple charges against all four of them. Now, David was convicted of multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2014, although he was never granted parole. He is still incarcerated. John received 2 life sentences with a minimum of 40 years, but he also is still incarcerated. Jamie was eventually sentenced to 2 life sentences as well, with a minimum of, I believe, 20 years, but he is still also incarcerated. And Wanda was sentenced to 12 to 25 years and spent that at the Women's Correctional Facility in Ohio. And I don't know for sure if she's still incarcerated or not. Now, in September of 1995, a young woman who was living with her husband in a house on South Fountain Road in Springfield, Ohio, went out to her garage to clean it up as part of a neighborhood clean-out project. Now, she and her husband had been living in this house for about a year and just had never done anything with their garage. So the garage had a dirt floor that was covered with just a bunch of junk. And as she moved this big, large wooden door out of the way, she notices the heel part of a shoe sticking out of the dirt floor. And when she goes down to pick it up, she realizes there's a human foot inside the shoe. So in this horrified panic, she races into the house. She and her husband call the police. And when the police come out to investigate, they discovered the body of 30-year-old Belinda Anderson, who had gone missing on September 7th of 1993. Her poor body had spent 2 years in this garage dirt floor. Now, they determined that the cause of death was either stabbing or a vicious beating, or maybe a combination of the two. And as horrifying as it was for Belinda's family to realize that this person that they loved so much had died such a brutal death and had spent the last 2 years buried in the dirt floor in a garage of someone's house, they were finally able to give her a proper burial. And then on the evening of February 25th, 1996, motorists on Interstate 70, just south of Springfield, Ohio, came upon a woman who was bleeding profusely standing on the side of the highway. A few people did stop to help her, and they were able to call a Care Flight helicopter to come and pick her up off the highway and whisk her away to a hospital in Dayton, Ohio, so she could receive some much needed medical attention. And this was 32-year-old Una Timmons. Now, when she got to the hospital and they examined her, they noticed that she had been stabbed in the face completely through both cheeks. It had knocked out 2 of her teeth and deeply sliced her tongue. And she also had signs on her face and also on her head that she had been severely beaten. Now, her story was that she was walking down the sidewalk, walking down the street in Springfield, Ohio, when a man in a dark station wagon picked her up, took her to go buy some crack cocaine, and then took her to an isolated area to have sex with her. And suddenly he just lost his temper and he started beating her with the butt of a gun and then stabbed her in the face. Now, somehow, and she didn't even remember how, she was able to get out of the car and take off running, and she just headed straight for the interstate. Now, she did give a description of this man. She said that he was a little over 6 feet tall, he weighed a little over 200 pounds, that he was Caucasian, that he had shoulder-length, greasy, curly brown hair, that he had thick, black-rimmed glasses, and was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. So the police go back to the isolated area that this man had taken Una to when he had beaten her and stabbed her, and started kind of looking around and surveying the area. And they noticed a house not far away, about a quarter mile away from the crime scene, that had a car that matched the description exactly, dark station wagon, sitting in the driveway. So of course the police go up and knock on the door, and who happens to answer the door but Karen Sapp, the same woman that answered the door when they were investigating the Hazel Pearson crime. Now, this is in a different area, so obviously the Sapp family had moved, but they thought it was very strange that the same woman is answering this door and that this car matches the exact description that Una gave them. So Karen has them come into the house and is talking to them and basically just tells the cops, yeah, I have no idea where Bill was last night. He was gone for hours. And as soon as Bill hears her say that, he takes off running for the back of the house and goes and hides behind the furnace. The police go right after him, arrest him, like cuff him, behind the furnace and take him down to the police station. And this is where this case busts wide open. So once they get him down to the police station and they start interrogating him, he pretty quickly confesses to the crime against Una Timmons. He says that he was out soliciting a sex worker, happened to pick her up, went to get crack cocaine, took her to the isolated area, and she said something that made him angry, and he just lost his temper and stabbed her and started beating her with the butt of a gun. And that basically that she was lucky that she got away because his plan was to kill her. So they decide in that moment, like, okay, we think this guy could be attached to some other crimes here, namely the crime against Hazel Pearson. And they're also wondering if maybe he was tied to Belinda Anderson, and also could he possibly be tied to Free Morrow and Martha Leach. So they instantly get a blood sample from him. They want his DNA. That is like of ultimate importance to the police officers, to get his DNA. And so, of course, they turn that into the FBI and they're getting that processed. And in the meantime, they're continuing to interrogate him about this crime and possibly other crimes. And he just starts to confess. He pretty quickly confesses to Belinda Anderson's murder. He also confesses to the almost murder of Hazel Pearson. And as they're continuing to interrogate him, guess what? The DNA results come back and it's a spot-on match to the DNA taken from Free Morrow and Martha Leach. And when they present him with this, he just confesses. Now, they did have some kind of unique interrogation tactics because he was sort of hinting at things that he'd done. So I guess I shouldn't say he just confessed right away, because that's not necessarily true. He was giving them little tidbits, little like hints that he possibly had committed these other crimes. But what they did was they went and grabbed Hazel Pearson's cut pants out of a cabinet nearby in the interrogation room and laid those out on the table for him. And it was like watching an artist, honestly, this is how they described it, being proud of their work. Like this was his handiwork, is how he looked at this. This was his signature, was slicing the inseam of Hazel Pearson's pants. And also they went and got Free Morrow's shorts and laid those down on the table. And again, he had that same kind of reaction and was boasting, this is my signature. I am this handy with a scalpel that I can cut the inseam of these shorts and these jeans without cutting my victim. I mean, it was just so bizarre. Another really major part of the interrogation process, the 16-hour interrogation process, was the police investigators really delving into his past, into Bill's past, into his childhood. And what they determined is that William, or Bill Sapp, was actually born William Kessler Lilly in September of 1962 in Springfield, Ohio. Now, initially, he and his younger brother, JR, were raised by their biological father and mother. However, their mother was extremely physically abusive. She was very mentally ill and would quite commonly beat Bill and his brother, JR, within an inch of their life on a very regular basis. Now, there was also a report that Bill had a much younger brother named Paul, who allegedly the mother set fire to, and he was removed from the home and put into an institution for the rest of his life. Eventually, his father did divorce his mother and remarried another woman, but she was equally as physically abusive to both Bill and JR, and actually horribly sexually abused both boys. Now, she would take a scalpel and cut the inseam of Bill's pants from one leg all the way through to the other, and then would drip hot candle wax on his genitalia before she would sexually assault him. So, I mean, he came from a very awful, abusive family, childhood. I mean, just horrible. And eventually, when he was old enough to leave home, he did go to Florida. Now, there was a murder of a woman in 1981. I can't remember the town of Florida that he was in, that they're pretty sure that he was responsible for. But for whatever reason, I think it was that they just didn't have enough physical evidence to conclusively tie him to the murder. But he did brag to fellow inmates while he was in jail, awaiting his sentencing for all the crimes that he was confessing to. They just, for whatever reason, I guess, like I said, not enough physical proof to tie him to that murder of the woman in Florida. But then eventually he ended up moving back to Springfield, Ohio. He actually met a man whose last name was Sapp that adopted him. So he took Sapp as his last name. He and Karen met, fell in love, had 3 children. She did report that on occasion he would be physically abusive to her, but I think really he was using other people, obviously, as his violent outlet. And also, when they were interrogating him about Free and Martha's sexual assaults and murders, and he was confessing to that, he basically corroborated the stories that John, David, Jamie, and Wanda gave the police. But he said that there was nothing ever done at the Linden Avenue apartment, that it was all, the whole crime took place at the pond behind the bakery. So I don't know. Again, I don't know that we're ever going to find out what truly happened to those poor, beautiful, innocent young women. Now, he did go to trial. Initially, they tried to say that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, which, oh, that just gets me. But they did have several psychologists actually testify that, yes, he did suffer from some pretty severe mental disorders, but that he also really knew the difference between right and wrong, and that actually the way in which he performed his crimes showed that he was in full control of all of his faculties, and that, no, he was not insane. So ultimately, he was found guilty of all 27 charges and was given 3 death sentences. And on October 13th, 1999, Bill Sapp officially entered into the prison system. He is still alive. He has not yet been executed. He is currently being housed at the Chillicothe Correctional Facility in Ohio. And, you know, one of the things that was so gut-wrenching for me to read was that at his trial, Hazel Pearson testified against him, Una Timmons testified against him, and also Benny Morrow, Susan, Free's mom, and then also Jetty, Martha's mom. They all testified against him, and they all were just a wreck on the stand. I cannot imagine having to face that guy and having to testify against him. Now, of course, as with all of my other true crime videos, I'm going to give you my 2 cents here. This was a very difficult book for me to read, a very difficult case for me to wrap my head around. I think one of the most difficult parts of it was the fact that in 1993, when they'd kind of narrowed down who they felt was responsible for the crimes against Free and Martha, because of the lack of physical evidence and the fact that nobody's DNA matched with the DNA sample that they had taken from the victims, that they had no other choice but to kind of, I guess, just, you know, let them go. And then it took a whole another little over a year to finally pin it on them and arrest them, charge them, put them in prison. That was really hard for me. It was infuriating that they never would name Bill Sapp. Basically, when Bill finally confessed, they were afraid of him, and he had threatened that he was going to kill all of them. And when they saw him completely master this whole crime scene, I mean, yes, Wanda Marszewski did come and help clean things up, but I mean, he was calling the shots from the very beginning. And basically, he arranged the whole thing. He arranged the whole thing. He started hanging out with John and Jamie and David. I don't know, just sick, so sick. And, you know, figured out a way to lure Free and Martha away. And, you know, ultimately they lost their lives. Just awful. And, you know, here we have another case of a man who has been horribly abused in his childhood. And, you know, I understand that. I understand that horrible, awful physical, sexual neglect, abuse, all of that can equal someone becoming a monster. I understand that. But when there are signs of clear abuse going on, what I don't understand is why the state or social services or child services, whatever, doesn't intervene and take care of it and get these kids some help so that they don't grow up and become monsters. I feel like the world that we live in is so reactive rather than being proactive, and that's so hard for me to understand. And I'm not excusing anyone's behavior here, okay? Not at all. I would never do that. I just wish with all of my heart that there had been some form of intervention for Bill Sapp. Also for John Balzer, Jamie Turner, David Marszewski, Wanda Marszewski. I mean, that whole situation is just so frightening and so scary. I understand that those guys had some severe cognitive deficiencies. from what I read, they were horribly teased. And, Bill Sapp was the ringleader. He orchestrated that entire crime from beginning to end. Really, Bill's reasoning was that Free, somewhere along the line, out in public somewhere, had smarted off to him and it pissed him off. So he was going to teach her a lesson. And I guess decided to enlist John, Jamie, David, and Wanda's help. I mean, and the fact that they went along with it, I don't know. I mean, I could sit here for hours and talk about how horrified I was about this case. And of course, my heart is just so broken for those families. How awful. Those families went through absolute hell because of the actions of Bill Sapp. Just unbelievable. And, I did give you a lot of detail in this video, but there's still quite a bit more detail that I could have given you. So if you're interested in finding out more, I do highly recommend checking out the Amazon link for this book and getting it and reading it yourself, because I touched on a lot, but there's still quite a few things I did not touch on. I will try to have another episode of True Crime Sunday up in August, but I can't promise you anything, but I'm going to do my best to try to get that done. It's hard, it's hard. These are not easy videos to put together. And, I really try to do my best to give you as much detail as I can and also be sensitive to the subject matter. So I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your lives to sit down and watch this, because I know it's not easy to get through, but I really do appreciate your time. I hope you guys are taking very good care of yourselves. Stay safe, and I will see you soon.